can't believe that I waited until the end of August to mention Tennessee at all on the show. And, you know, for a lot of reasons, they're going to be one of the most fascinating teams to talk about this season. I mean, we could talk about Nico all we want, right? I mean, that storyline's obviously always going to be there to some degree, especially when they're pretty much going to be compared to UCLA just because of essentially a trade off that they did. But at the same time, too, Tennessee is a school that loves football, and their athletic department, you can tell that they've invested a lot of money into the program in general. I mean, football for their program raises over $150 million a year, and they're finding new creative ways to get NIL collectives going and to get different funds and raising their tickets, etc. And you can definitely tell that they've invested a lot into their facilities as well. But when you look at this football program, there's obviously the big elephant in the room is the quarterback room, right? I mean, obviously Joey Aguilar coming in from UCLA. All things considered, I mean, the kid's got a solid arm. I don't think people necessarily need to be panicking about him. I think he's going to be serviceable, especially when you go into the year thinking that your options were either Jake Mellinger or George McIntyre going into the season. So, I mean, all things considered, I mean, I think you got to be pretty happy with having a guy like Joey Aguilar who can come in and kind of facilitate this offense too, right? Because it's not necessarily going to be the high flying offense that you would necessarily expect out of a Josh Heupel offense. However, they definitely have the pieces necessary to really kind of put something together too. Because last year the Vols, they ranked 15th in the nation in total offense, 12th in scoring, and the passing game was solid. It was solid, but not necessarily spectacular. I, for one, noticed that if you go back and watch some of those Tennessee games, there were a couple moments where Nico really missed some really key throws in a lot of critical moments. I mean, I think of that connection with Squirrel White, for example, in a couple of plays where he's overthrowing him, and considering how fast he is, that's really kind of difficult to do. And granted, too, when you have the best rushing attack in the SEC, that also kind of helps you as well. So if you ask me, I would almost argue that the running back room is probably a bigger story than the quarterback room to some degree, because you think about that element of it, where that's really was their identity last year in terms of more or less relying on Dylan Sampson. And, the offensive line wasn't exactly strong in pass protection either. So I think there is a part of it that says, Nico necessarily wasn't as great as people necessarily give him credit for. But I would also argue that the offensive line definitely didn't help him as much as I think that people would necessarily say. So combining with the question marks you have at trying to get the rushing attack back together, you're also only bringing back a handful of starters on offense. You don't really have that marquee player that you can necessarily build an offense around. I mean, Joey Aguilar is serviceable, but he's not necessarily going to be that guy. And, they necessarily didn't do a great job in terms of the transfer portal either. I mean, they only brought in about 7 transfers, 25 commits this year, but they're also very close to getting a top 10 class. I mean, they're ranked 11th in terms of recruiting this year and 13th last year. So, I mean, they're still pretty consistent, all things considered. But when I look at this running back room, yes, all eyes are going to be on the quarterback situation to a degree, but I'm really kind of focused on this rushing attack. And I guess for me, if I were a Tennessee fan, I'm really just kind of fascinated to see where Josh Heupel and offensive coordinator Joey Hazel kind of take this, because Sampson was freaking dominant and so much fun to watch. I mean, rushed for over 1,500 yards, 22 touchdowns. And now you essentially have this, I would say, two-man dynamic between Peyton Lewis and Deshaun Bishop. They're both younger backs. And, Bishop averaged about 6 yards per carry last year. So I would probably argue it's going to be more or less a kind of a rotation compared to, Dylan Sampson more or less being a workhorse. So I'm definitely kind of curious to see how they decide to trickle that down too, because at the same time, too, I think it's going to be probably a little bit more balanced this year in the sense that I don't necessarily think you can rely on Joey Aguilar to just sling the ball all around. Because yes, I think it's noteworthy that he threw for close to 6,700 yards and 56 touchdowns with Appalachian State. But at the same time, too, he also threw 14 interceptions last year. And at least for me, that's pretty noteworthy when you're in the SEC and there's so many great secondaries. Obviously, for example, Alabama, I think they have one of the best secondaries in the entire country. So that's going to be something that they're going to have to face as well. But outside of that, I also want to mention this wide receiver room real quick too, because I do think Tennessee has a lot of solid talent everywhere, but there's not necessarily some talent that you necessarily sit there and say, oh, well, this guy is going to be the obvious quote unquote guy. Because whether you like it or not, Tennessee fans, you're going to have to play some freshmen this year. But also you have a guy in Chris Brazzell II, and you also have some underclassmen such as Mike Matthews and Braylon Stanley that are going to get some opportunities, that are going to have to be a lot more of an instrumental part in really kind of getting this program back together. Because I'd say first and foremost, I don't think anybody's necessarily sitting here saying, okay, they're going to go for the college football playoff or they're going to have 10 or 11 wins. I don't think anybody's necessarily having that expectation for them. Even if Nico was there, I don't know if that would necessarily be the expectation, because I think, objectively speaking, they definitely have lost some critical pieces. They're going to be relying on some younger guys, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. And also, too, the offensive line definitely had some issues last year. You replaced 4 starters, and you're going to be replacing Cooper Mays, who's going to end up, he was a really solid guy for him. But also, when you bring in a guy like Sam Pendleton, who is from Notre Dame, and for those who watch Notre Dame and their run to the national championship, he was a really instrumental piece when Notre Dame was really thin on the offensive line. So I think he's going to be, at least in my opinion, they're definitely their best signing in terms of the transfer portal, and somebody who I think is going to have an immediate impact on this program. So I think you have to be excited that you have a guy like that who's taken a lot of snaps, who's been in a lot of big moments, and most importantly, hopefully gives Joey Aguilar another reason to truly be confident in his offensive line. And I think that's something that you really didn't get to see as much last year. But in terms of defensively, I think that's clearly going to be the strength of this team again, right? Because you look at some of the guys that they have. I think Joshua Josephs is a guy that's really a lot of fun to watch, and somebody who's just explosive. He's all over the field. I wouldn't be surprised if he, for all I know, he could have a third straight year with 100 tackles. So expect him to be extremely productive. You also got Bryson Eason and Jackson Moy, who are going to be some interior linemen that hopefully cause some disruption for this Tennessee defensive line, and hopefully brings a little bit less pressure for this secondary, who I would argue is definitely legit, and at least in my opinion, certainly the strength of this team. And also, I would argue, carried them in a lot of big moments last season. Because when I look at this Vols secondary, I also have to give a shout out to Rickey Gibson III and Jermod McCoy, who's coming off an ACL injury. But I would argue probably their most valuable player, absolutely. Because, we can talk about Nico, we can talk about the running back room, but I also wanted to, I think also the defense has to be worthy of a mention too. And it's not necessarily that I think Tennessee is going to take this huge step back where we're talking about them in a 6 or 7 kind of territory. I think we're just talking about, hey, I think it's obviously going to be a little bit of a reset kind of year for Tennessee. But the conversation more or less is, hey, based off what we have right now, and I think it's absolutely phenomenal that Josh Heupel said, hey, we're not going to rely on the transfer portal. We're going to trust in our facilities. We're going to trust in our NIL, and we're really going to be strategic in terms of who we bring in. And to me, that seems very, very evident in terms of not only their 2025 class, but their 2026 class as well. And a couple guys I definitely want to give a shout out to in terms of their 2025 class. I think David Sanders is going to be someone who is definitely going to be a contributor for years to come. Isaiah Campbell as well, who I'm definitely a huge fan of. And also George McIntyre, who's going to more than likely be their backup quarterback or freshman, 5-star kid, somebody who is definitely going to be, an interesting kid to see as they go into this season as well. And, all things considered, I think you have to at least be optimistic with Tennessee. I mean, because when you look at Josh Heupel's track record, obviously they lost in the first round in the college football playoff last year, finishing 10-3. Year before that, they have a victory in the Citrus Bowl. In 2022, they went 11-2. So going into Heupel's fifth season, I mean, what really should be the expectation? I mean, 37-15 overall as a head coach. I think if you're Tennessee, I think you're kind of hoping for another 9-4 season where you do play a legitimate bowl game, such as an Orange Bowl or a Citrus Bowl, some sort of equivalent of that. And you really kind of ask yourself, hey, the quarterbacks that we brought in this season, can we develop them into possibly being the guy for next year now? Because now you're kind of seeing this trend a little bit where teams like Ohio State, for example, they're willing to play a redshirt freshman. So who's to say Tennessee won't do the same thing? I mean, even if you look at the track record of the quarterbacks that they've had some really phenomenal quarterbacks come in, such as Joe Milton, for example, who is so much fun to watch, and a guy that could just make pretty much every throw on the field. So I definitely have a lot of faith in terms of this Tennessee team. Now, granted, I just rattled off a bunch of question marks in terms of this team. I'm not trying to shit on Tennessee at all. In fact, I think I'm probably a little bit more optimistic than most. But I think at the same time, too, it is noteworthy that there is a good amount of question marks here in terms of this Tennessee team. But at least on a positive note that I think I also want to add too is that Tennessee's schedule, I would argue, is really manageable in terms of an SEC schedule. Now, granted, on August 30th, I think playing Syracuse is definitely going to be a game where you have some potential to really kind of make a statement early, especially for a Syracuse team that is more or less kind of rebuilding it in a similar sort of setting compared to where Tennessee's at right now. So I think that's going to be a really great start. That's going to be a noon kickoff on ABC. So that's certainly a game I'm going to be checking out. And then September 13th, you're hosting number 5 Georgia. And that's going to be a game that I think you really kind of sit there and say to yourself, hey, this is really going to kind of set the tone for the rest of the season. Because granted, you play a couple laugher games versus East Tennessee State and UAB and Mississippi State afterwards. But if you can come off and at least play Georgia competitively, where this defense can at least keep you in the game and Joey Aguilar doesn't throw too many interceptions, they could certainly make things interesting. Because even when you look at the rest of the way, I mean, you face an Arkansas team that we're all kind of unsure about. You have to go on the road versus Alabama, and that's always going to be a difficult matchup no matter what. And then later in the year, it's relatively manageable. I mean, you do play some tough games versus Oklahoma, and you go on the road versus Florida, and then you finish the year at Vanderbilt. So, I mean, I think all things considered, I think you have to be at least somewhat happy with the schedule. Now, granted, in the SEC, it's always going to be tough. It's always going to be difficult. But at the same time, too, I think a lot of Tennessee fans are honest with themselves and saying, hey, we know that this is going to be a little bit of a reset year. We know that we have some uncertainties in the quarterback room and the running back room and within the defensive line. However, they have a lot of strengths. They have a manageable schedule. And I think there's no reason why they can't win at least 8 wins this season.